Beautiful downtown Beaufort. It's a sunny day here, albeit a little bit cold. And I'd like to welcome you to Book Sandwiched In. And this is the 35th year of Book Sandwiched In. And as many of you know, if not all of you, that we invite prominent Beaufortonians or authors to discuss their books over a period of usually the lunch hour, 12 to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And this has typically been live at USCB, University of South Carolina in Beaufort, in the Performing Arts Center. But due to COVID, we decided to do this all virtually this year. And so welcome again to all of you that have signed in. As we mentioned, I think last time, on February 7th, we went live with our online auction. And usually we would raffle off prizes at the end of each session. We decided to do an online auction, which many of you already have taken a look at. And I would urge you to go in and bid often. All the funds that you raise are for the libraries in Northern Beaufort County, in Beaufort, Lobico, and St. Helena Island. So we have a number of different prizes there from folks from our businesses downtown and here in the area. A wide variety of gifts. I highlighted two things today: a pendant from Bay Street Jewelers in honor of Valentine's Day, as well as books from Nevermore Books. And they've graciously donated the books for really all the sessions over the course of Book Sandwich In. So again, feel free to jump in, take a look at the items and bid often. And I see that many of you folks have already done that. I've done that myself, and I will continue to do so. There's some pretty good looking prizes in there. Today we have a special day for you. This is a Valentine's special. And if you've got the schedule of events, well, let me just back up. There's one last housekeeping thing to mention. Next week, we are going to have Jonathan Haupt he's the executive director at the Pat Conroy Center, and he will be discussing The Water is Wide. It's the 50th anniversary, and we had to make a schedule change, and Jonathan's graciously agreed to do that, and we'll be seeing more of him next week. So with that being said, we've got a special Valentine's Day offering for you, and it's entitled For the Love of Books. And this is two friends talk about how the love of books shape their lives. And that's Trish Hempel and Marley Rusoff. And they're distinguished folks in their own right. And let me just read a little bit from both of their bios. We'll start with Patricia. Patricia first won recognition for A Romantic Education, a Cold War memoir about her Czech family history. And she and I are both Czech, so we kind of relate to that. Widely considered a classic. Other books that she's written, such as The Florist's Daughter, Virgin Time, and her most recent book, The Art of a Wasted Day. And after 2 years, I think we can all relate to sometimes there have been wasted days as part of this COVID experience. So, but that's her latest book, but she's written stories that appeared in the New Yorker, Granta, the best American essays, best American short stories, as well as the New York Times. She taught at the University of Minnesota for many years as a member of the permanent faculty of the Prague Summer Program, where she teaches most summers. She lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she met Marley Rusoff when they were both 18 years old. So they've been almost lifelong friends. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you.
Marley Rusoff. Again, knowing Patricia for as long as she had, almost a lifelong friend. Her love of books inspired her to open a bookstore near the University of Minnesota that quickly became a gathering place for local poets and writers. When she ran out of space, she expanded into an apartment upstairs. And with the essential support and encouragement of her writer friends, most especially Patricia, she started The Loft, now a nationally recognized nonprofit organization whose mission is to foster writing and reading community. Foster a writing and reading community. In 2001, Marley opened the Marley Rusoff Literary Agency. She's represented fiction and memoirs by authors such as Pat Conroy, Patricia Hampel, Ron Rash, Simon Tolkien, Paulina Poroskova, just to name a few, and Cassandra King. In 2016, she and her husband joined with Cassandra King Conroy in the founding of the Pat Conroy Literary Center here in Beaufort. And as many of you know, the Pat Conroy Center is often listed as the #1 tourist attraction here in Beaufort. So it's gained wide acceptance and certainly gained popularity over the years in honor of Pat. So welcome, Marley. And ladies, this is a conversation between the two lifelong friends, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jean. And I, as you all know now, have been friends for a very long time, since we were young women, actually. In terms of our writing life or reading life, one of the major events that happened in Minneapolis for me as a young bookseller was when the New Yorker accepted Look at a Teacup, which was an essay that later was included as a short story, I believe, in Best American Short Stories. And it was about her grandmother and about her Czech family. It was an amazing, wonderful thing, because it not only was wonderful for Trish, it was wonderful for all of us, because in a sense, it gave us the confidence and the realization that art and culture were not controlled completely by the two coasts, that we could actually have genius and art right in our prairie state of Minnesota. And so Trish represented all of us in a sense when the New Yorker published her story. It was an event that we celebrated in the upstairs of my bookstore in this funky sort of apartment that I had rented to expand the bookstore. And it was in that apartment a year later that the Loft became a reality. At that time, that apartment was a bookstore, but at night it had a secret sort of nightlife. And it was a number of writers, particularly from Iowa, who'd come to Minneapolis and who wanted to conduct small workshops. Were conducting small workshops in the upstairs of my bookstore. And I think that grew and grew, and until, we realized that there were many, many people who needed to be servants of the world of literature and who wanted entree into that world. So when I was asked to do this, I thought there was no better person for me to share the screen with than Patricia Hampel. Later on, just so you know, when her first book, Romantic Education, was published, I had left the bookstore and I was working for Houghton Mifflin. And so I had the honor of introducing one of my best friends when her first book was published. So we celebrated Look at a Teacup in the New Yorker, and then the Houghton Mifflin Literary Fellowship was awarded to Patricia for her book, A Romantic Education. And I came back from Chicago, where I was working for Houghton Mifflin, to introduce her for that book. So welcome, Patricia, and thank you so much for being here with me today, and frankly, always.
Oh, hi, Marley. Happy Valentine's Day. I want to tell everybody to be very aware that when Marley says we, usually it's a part of her kind of inevitable and congenital graciousness. And one of the things that she says we did, she did, and she should be saying I. The Loft Literary Center was her idea. Most writers are pretty self-absorbed and involved with their work. And I don't think the bunch of us who kind of gravitated to Marley's bookstore, which for us was like Shakespeare and Company in Paris. She was our Sylvia Beach. She was the person who made it possible to find a place. The university was not such a place. There were no creative writing programs there at the time. She let us teach courses. We all had graduate degrees by then from Iowa, many of us. And she let us come up there and teach courses on women's literature, and people in the community would come and act as if we knew what we were talking about, and they would sign up for a course for which they got no credit, of course, but it was a passionate kind of teaching and community. And Marley looked at it, I think, and thought, wait a minute, this should have some kind of permanent life. And what she had in mind was that inevitable relationship between readers and writers. And today is a perfect day, I think, for us to be celebrating that, because although I know we all like to think that Valentine's Day is the day for lovers, and of course it is, and the day for chocolate, which I hope it is. It's also really, from my Catholic girlhood, it is the day of friendship, not only because we always gave everybody in our class a Valentine on that day. It was considered very wrong to just pick the people you like to give Valentines to, but because in those days, St. Valentine was actually on the list of saints. I think they've kicked him off now as a fictional character, which should never be done to a fictional character. They're more real than most of us. But anyway, they gave us a picture of him. He was a monk sitting in a little cell with, a grate, he was forced to be in the cell because he was a Christian, I guess, or something. I don't know why he was there, but he wrote to all his friends while he was in prison, and a little white dove would come and take these letters and send them out to his friends. An image that was so vital to me, the idea that really Valentine's Day was writers and readers. I had that from childhood. So hi, Marley, happy Valentine's.
Happy Valentine's Day. There's another thing I want to say about Trish, and it's hard to imagine that at the time that she wrote A Romantic Education, that ordinary people were not writing memoirs.
That's
I mean,
true.
it really, really was true that memoirs were written by politicians and statesmen and maybe an actor here and there.
But somebody who slept with one, kiss and tell kind of
Kiss
thing.
and tell or something. And when she was brave enough in her 20s to step forward and say, I have something to say, and submit a book to Houghton Mifflin, it was an act of courage. It was totally an act of courage. And in many ways, I thought she launched the whole rise of the personal memoir of ordinary people, but she certainly has paralleled the first person narrative of memoir for the whole length of her career. And I think it was because of that courage and her willingness to put herself forward as the subject and speak from the I voice that she was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. I'm sorry, Trish, you don't like it when I call it the Genius Grant, but I've always been so proud of you for having received it. And that was, I believe, what year was that? Was that 1990?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the thing about memoir, because honestly, always glad to be thought of as brave, but I that was the case. I mean, I just had a book that I really wanted to write. I had no notion that this thing would be called, nor was it called on the cover or anywhere, a memoir. It was just this odd duck thing. And I had worked in journalism and I had published a book of poetry. I'd never taken a prose writing class in my life. So I just only wrote it because I needed a canvas for this story about, the Cold War and this Czech thing. But what was really interesting, when you first have a book published, you go into the bookstore and you say, hi, wondering if you have a book called A Romantic Education by Patricia Hampel. And, aside from them saying, yeah, you wrote it, I bet, that's why you're asking for it. I couldn't find it in any of the bookstores because there was no category. Sometimes I'd find it in art history or European history, or on one very sad day, I found it in self-help. You could find it anywhere. But 10 years later, actually 11 years later, when I published another memoir, I walked in and there was this category in the bookstores called memoir. So there was something that was happening. It wasn't just me, but there was something that was happening during that period that caused the memoir to become not a retrospective kind of form, but a kind of the quest, you might say the quest literature of our age. So now we're used to it, you know. I mean, we feel if you haven't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you know, you aren't alive in our times, for example. So yeah, that it's an important thing. But Marley was somebody who understood all that and understood the relationship between poetry, which of course was always personally voiced, and the prose writing that was coming out. Not only, of course, she's an incredible fiction editor and agent, but also understood what was happening with that first person voice. So, you know, I look back on it and I think, you know, I'm not surprised that we're the age we are, but what surprises me is to go back and see the history of American writing and literature during that period and how, you know, we were there, we are still there, but I mean, we were pinpointing, and you were pinpointing that, even like the foundation of the loft, the creation of a place that would recognize that you don't just support literature by buying a book. That's a good start, but that there has to be some kind of coming together of readers and writers.
Yeah. Well, I think our paths, when I think about my life in books, the first thing I think about is myself as a 3-year-old with a father who's a bookbinder. And I adored my father. And he would go off to work in a bookbindery. And from the time I was really young, I would crawl into the back seat of his big Buick and curl myself up into a little ball and hope that he wouldn't notice me until he was downtown St. Paul and got to his bookbindery, because I knew then I could at least count on staying until lunchtime when he would drive me back home. And I would sit among all the books in various stages of repair. And I believe that what my father did, I mean, it may seem boring to people, but the fact that he was a doctor of books, that he fixed them, and the books could get broken, and they felt to me like they were alive and they were people, because I'd say, what's wrong with this book? And the spine is broken. Oh my goodness, the spine is broken. A torn jacket, you know, even the language of the bindery was a very human language. In addition to sort of it being a land of books, it was also a place of stories, because, and this is also shows how old I am, because all the small town newspapers used to mail every issue of their local newspaper to my father's bindery, and he would bind them up in big books so that every year they had a record. This is before microfiche, before anything else. And so when I got older, like 10 or 11 or 12, I could read what was in these small town newspapers. And they were always stories that someone came to town to visit, someone got married, someone got an award, but they were not, you know, the news of the day. It was not like what was going on in Eastern Europe or whatever it was. It was stories of people's lives. So I really have spent a whole life obsessed with stories and preserving them in various forms. And so it's somehow, I didn't know there was such a thing as a literary agent. And in fact, when I opened my bookstore, I didn't even know what I was doing. I had no money. There was no reason in the world that someone in her early 20s with $2,000 borrowed could have a bookstore. But the truth is, my life was such that I needed, no matter how many times I changed my major at the University of Minnesota, I was never happy. And when I started working part-time in a bookstore, I thought, I found my destiny here. You know, I need to be surrounded by books. I need to be surrounded by people who love books. And I need my own bookstore because I need to be able to shape what it is that I offer to the world. And so the bookstore became a way for me to extend my education. It was a small bookstore, maybe 800 square feet or something like that on the downstairs until I opened the upstairs. But what I would do is, if I became interested in a subject, if I was on campus, so there were lots of people coming around who were interesting, I could add a section to the bookstore, and I would put a shelf. And maybe it was a shelf on Carl Jung, and I got books from Switzerland, and suddenly I had Jungians hanging around my bookstore that I could talk to. So it was a way of learning, of having a life that was vital and learning. And I couldn't afford to continue at the university. My father had died, and I needed, though, to continue, and I wasn't ready to leave campus. So what did I do? I opened a bookstore, and I didn't realize until later, when I was working with as an agent for Jessica Jackley, who was the founder of Kiva. And she, in her book, Clay, Water, Brick, talked about entrepreneurs. And she described them, I think it was based on something that Paul Samuelson from Harvard, who was a Nobel laureate in economics, had said, that an entrepreneur is someone who moves forward without resources at hand, without permission, without pedigree, without anything. And that was me. I just decided that that's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to provide books to people. And in my bookstore, because I loved poetry, I had a whole wall of poetry. I mean, it was a crarazy thing.
I was going to say
the bookstores didn't do that. When I
was going to say that
around other bookstores, there would be a shelf like this. I had 10 feet, 8 by 8 of poetry books. And so what did that do? That meant that poets came. And so that was the beginning of my sort of education and my passion for books.
Yeah, I was going to say that because there's no bookstore in America. Certainly there were no bookstores in the Twin Cities that would have one whole wall of poetry. I mean, it was not that other things weren't there, but poetry was so honored. And I can see you there with all these books being delivered, boxes of books. And I don't know how you got any work done, because we all wanted to talk to you. We would just constantly come in. I was working freelance, and my boyfriend and I, who's also a writer, we would come in, and other people were there. We were all just yakking away at you, and there weren't coffee shops or anything like that at that time. And you would be busy putting books on the shelves, and here, would you hold this for a second? But basically it was open. It was a salon. I mean, the salon, before it became the loft, was right there as you were working, and you had to kind of babysit all these wannabe writers who saw this as the home turf. And I didn't ever question the fact that this very young person owned a bookstore. To me, it was just, that was the way it was. But I look back at it and think, about me being brave. I mean, you were heroic. That was an incredible thing. And
I didn't, and again, I remember when Carol Bly, Robert Bly's wife, came in the store one day after I'd opened, and she looked at me. People used to come in and ask for my father. They didn't know that it was me. They'd say, Mr. Rusoff here. But when Carol came in and said, "My goodness, you're brave," and as soon as she said it, I started to tremble, because that I was brave. I thought, if I knew I had to be brave, I'm not sure I would have done it, but it was just what I needed to do.
Well, I think that, one of the things that I wanted to ask about is the line between being a reader as a child, even, that child experience, which I think we should talk about, because that's so important. And Valentine's Day, as I say, I feel more strongly my child memories come up more than even my romantic ones, because of all the fuss that was made in school about St. Valentine, but also how you got from that through the different stages of your literary life to becoming an agent. And hey, my agent.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about friendship, I had no idea that there was such a thing as a literary agent. But I had heard one of my customers was a young Jungian analyst who moved to Minnesota from California. She'd gone to Santa Cruz and had been the teaching assistant to Norman O. Brown. And I heard a lecture, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. It was about the Persephone myth. And Robert Bly came into my store, and he was also sort of Jungian obsessed. And I said to him, Robert, who's your editor in New York? And he told me her name is Fran McCullough. She's my editor. So
she was Sylvia Plath's editor too, wasn't she?
I think she was.
Yeah.
And so my sister had moved to New York, and so I was going to go stay with my sister. And I decided that I would take Nora's lecture notes on the Moon and the Virgin, which I called it, and go find Fran McCullough. And I had no clue that you needed an appointment. I had no idea of what I was doing. So in my long hippie skirt, I come wandering into the Harper and Row building and asked the receptionist if I could please see Frances McCullough. And they asked me, of course, do you have an appointment? And I said, no, but I'm only in town for 3 days. I would be grateful if she'd see me. So she invited me into her office, and I boldly went in and I sat down and I said, I think I have an idea for a book that would be a perfect Harper and Row book. And the person to write it, her name is Nora Hall, and it's a book on the Persephone myth and the meaning for women today. So I pitched the book, and Fran looked at me and sort of bewildered. But anyway, she said to me, well, are you her agent? And I said, what's an agent? And so Fran McCullough is the one who told me. She said, well, an agent is someone who represents the interests of a writer. So I thought, well, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I'm her friend. I'm representing her interests. So I said, well, yes, I'm her agent. And so in the end, Harper and Row offered a contract for the book. And this is another way in which Trish and I are connected, because once the contract came, I didn't know what the hell to do with it, because I'd never seen a book contract. So I called Trish and I said, Trish, she had already signed with someone from William Morris. So I said, Trish, do you have a contract you can give to me? I need to look at it. So she said, sure. So she comes by with her contract. It must have been for, I don't know, was it for a poetry book?
It was for a romantic education. And it had in it something that was so amusing to me and my then agent, and would be to anybody today. I was signing rights to the British Empire. They still use that lingo.
Yeah,
that's still an empire. But anyway, go ahead.
So all I did was I took your contract and I took their contract, and anything that Rhoda Wire had crossed out, I crossed out. And so I just made it sort of work. But what I didn't do was put in an agency clause where I got a percentage, because I didn't take money from a friend. So I ended up selling at least 3 books this way. I'd go to visit my sister and I'd sell a book, but it never occurred to me. In fact, I was only making $50 a week in my bookstore. I mean, it's really ridiculous, but I was working so hard, but I never felt that I was working. I was living, right? It was my life. So once I decided that I needed a job, it wouldn't have ever occurred to me to be an agent, because I never made a penny doing it. And what happened was, once I got to New York, I started in sales and traveled the Midwest. I left the bookstore. I sold it for $1 to an employee. I went on the road. The loft at that time had moved into a much larger space. And I began as a book traveler. But when I was offered Chicago by Houghton Mifflin, I started with Simon & Schuster. They wanted me to handle only major accounts. And I'd gone through so many blizzards in Wisconsin and Iowa and North Dakota. I thought if I continue with the territory I had been given by Simon & Schuster, I'll be dead in a year. So I took a job, moved to Chicago, and worked for Houghton Mifflin. And it was Houghton Mifflin that moved me ultimately to New York and made me the head of publicity after about 1.5 years. And so I suddenly found myself, without ever having intended to live in New York, without ever having intended to be in publishing, living in Manhattan in my sister's studio apartment, and working for Houghton Mifflin. So that was sort of how I ended up in New York. And at that point, I started seeing, and again, I didn't pay much attention to it, but as I was invited to more meetings, editorial meetings and meetings with teams, an agent would come in, and they were always extremely well dressed in designer suits. And I would often see them get into limousines and leave. And I thought, what's wrong with this picture? Obviously, there is something. Agents are making money, and that there's something there. But again, it never occurred to me. I was so busy working at Houghton. And when I tell you the books I got to work on, I mean, you can understand, I think, how extraordinary it was, because I think it was 1980. It was 1981 when I moved to New York, or maybe 82. In 84, I was working with Margaret Atwood on The Handmaid's Tale. And I had just married Mihai, who many of you know. And I was I was taking a trip to Toronto to visit with her. And in packing, I had to iron a linen blouse. It was hot. It was summer. It was probably July or August. So I'm ironing a linen blouse, and I see it says made in Romania. And I turned to Mihai and I said, Mihai, look, this blouse was made in Romania. And Mihai, who was still a mystery to me at that point, says, yes, and I know that the factory that blouse was made in. And I said, well, how could you know that? And he said, well, because his job was in charge of all the models for light industry, because Ceausescu couldn't read a blueprint. And so he had a staff of 17 people creating what I used to call toys for the dictator, so he could admire the growth of industry in Romania. So Mihai said the factory that made clothes to be shipped out to the West was not far from my house. And just before I left, I drove by one day and there were women standing on the second and third story ledges of the factory outside the windows. And so I said, Mihai, why? I don't get it. And he said that Ceausescu wanted more babies. And so he was sending like nurses and gynecologists and people into the factories to try to attract pregnant women. And if they didn't deliver a baby when they thought, they could be called into court. And that was an image that I could not get out of my head. So when I arrived in Toronto and talked to Margaret Atwood about The Handmaid's Tale, I said, we used to call her Peggy, so did you know about this? My husband just explained this to me about Romania. And she said, yes. And I said, my God, why don't we know about these things? And she said that she had done a tremendous amount of research for The Handmaid's Tale. And I said, do you have clippings? And she said, yes, I do. And so I said, I want to see your file. So she gave me the clipping file from The Handmaid's Tale, and she had never had a bestseller. So what we did was we developed a campaign that said, The Handmaid's Tale, everything that happens in this book is happening today or at some time in history, The Handmaid's Tale. And it became a big bestseller, and it was her first bestseller. And I keep thinking, if it hadn't been for that linen blouse, I might not have asked to see her clipping file. I might not have asked where the ideas came from. And so the way fate sort of works in mysterious ways is something I'm very aware of.
Well, and I've always thought that, most readers, I include myself, have this romantic notion of the relationship between an editor and a writer. And most of it's based on one relationship or two relationships, one editor, and that's Maxwell Perkins. And his relationship with, a number of writers, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Marjorie Rawlings. But the truth of the matter is the business side of publishing has changed so utterly that editors are jumping around all over the place, and you end up publishing around. You don't have you aren't married to one editor, but your agent becomes the person. I mean, the word agent sounds so cold and kind of, you can hear a cash register clinging around there, but it's not like that. It's really your first editor. It's the person who is with you when you're talking about ideas. It's the person who's with you as you're going through drafts. It's the person who's taking you all the way through. And just like publicity sounds like, oh, it's like, just an ad campaign. No, it has a much stronger relationship to the whole editorial process. And in some ways, my last editor, the most recent editor I had come up, as they say, came up through publicity, just as you came up through publicity. But to say that category was just about advertising or public relations is not even remotely what it's about. Yeah. It's a much more intimate relationship with your imaginative resources. At least it has been for me. And lucky for me that about the time that I left my other agent, because she was ending her agency, it was literally at that time that Marley decided to, you'd been a publisher for a while with Morrow, and you decided, what do I like about this business? I like working with writers, and you decided to become an agent. And everybody said, you really shouldn't, when you have such a close friend, you shouldn't go into business with them. And I thought, to hell with that. This is Marley. This is me. And we've been together for over 20 years. And she saved my bacon and many others.
The interesting part of when I was working for First Houghton, another coincidence, I had met Pat Conroy in my bookstore. He came in one day with his sister Carol, who was a poet.
And lived in Minneapolis at that
Lived in
time.
Minneapolis. And he left with an armload of poetry books. I think he made my week. You know, Pat was a voracious reader of poetry. So I got to know Pat, and there was a group of people that writers. It was a small circle. And I look back on it with great fondness, who used to travel in the summer up to the North Shore of Lake Superior and stay in these little tar paper shacks that were on, it was called Gunderson's Resort on Lake Superior. And it was a gorgeous landscape. And Pat came up with his sister Carol, and Trish was there. And two or three of our other poets, Minnesota poets, had little cabins there. And we'd have meet for breakfast at the local cafe, or go to Betty's Pie Shop if we wanted to take a ride. And they would write. And Pat fell in love with this little enclave of poets and writers. And so he came and spent 2 or 3 summers in Minnesota up at Gunderson's cabins.
Gunderson's modern cabins, which meant there was an indoor toilet. That was the word modern meant indoor toilet.
Yeah, I mean, it was, but so when I was working with Nan Talese at Houghton Mifflin, one day she came into my office with this huge manuscript. Jonathan Galassi had left to go to another publishing house. Jonathan had been Pat's first editor. So Nan had this gigantic manuscript. And she says, this author says he knows you. Would you read this along with me? And I said, who is it? And she said, Pat Conroy. And so she deposits on my desk The Prince of Tides. And that was the first Conroy book that I worked on. And I've worked on every book since, either as a publicity, marketing, a publisher, agent, whatever it is. And that was a book that turned his career into made him a star. The other, you know, and part of what happened with that was that I knew a lot about Pat's relationship with his family. You know, one of the things we did up at the North Shore, we would sit by the campfire and talk. And so he knew everything about my dysfunction in my family. I knew everything about his. And so when we wrote the bio, the author bio, it was not like a typical author bio. It was about his family and about the abused childhood and the whole thing. And he was willing to accept this, in all honesty, to put that forward. And he'd done that already with the great Santini to a degree. But what happened is that he became sort of the patron saint for the truth telling about family secrets. And when he spoke at the American Booksellers Convention in 1985, I think it was, in New Orleans, I've never, even today, the American Booksellers Association, which is now called has another name, they say it was the most galvanizing speech that they'd ever had, and that it was the launch of Pat Conroy into a superstardom. In fact, he was speaking with Walter Cronkite and I can't remember, an actress, you know. And afterwards, when we went back to the convention center, the line was so long at the Houghton Mifflin booth to try to greet Pat Conroy, that we had the fire marshals on our back. But the first person in line was Walter Cronkite, who wanted to meet Pat Conroy. It was really, really an amazing thing. So, and the speech that he made there is included in A Low Country Heart. At least an excerpt. I think there may be a few words missing because we had to use a funky tape to do it. But I swear it was the turning point in his career was that speech.
You know, I wanted to make sure we talk about a couple of other things. And one is your and my, but especially your relationship to Eastern Europe and to the work you did in Czechoslovakia as it was then. The country was not divided yet, right after the Cold War. Because when I wrote A Romantic Education, it was deep Cold War. We really believed that the Iron Curtain would last, well, forever. We didn't understand that in October and November of 1989, it was going to just disappear. And so I wanted to talk about that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about our lives as children reading and and inevitably talk a little bit about censorship. But anyway, about Eastern Europe.
Well, I think Eastern Europe and censorship go together, because one of the things that is appalling about what happened in Eastern Europe was the lack of freedom of speech. And that Stalinist period, where Stalin killed more poets than anyone in history, you know. So you go from that kind of censorship that is where it's dangerous, where ideas become dangerous. One of the last essays that Pat wrote for a blog piece was about his fear of what political correctness would do on college campuses. And I think that's, we see that. I had a problem with a beautiful novel that I'm going to mention now. In fact, it's a book by a 90-year-old woman called The Marshbird. And I'd taken it to publishers, and I swear to you, it would please readers of Pat Conroy for her depiction of the Low Country and for the heart she gives to these characters, the characters that she's developed of these, an orphan half race, a mixed race girl and a white abandoned boy. I mean, this should have sold, at least for a portion of the market of the Where the Crawdad Sings, but everyone turned it down in New York because it was said among the Gullah, and they said that this was cultural appropriation. Yet there were white characters. The author was white. As soon as they knew she was white, they rejected it. It was right after the American Dirt scandal happened. And so I couldn't ask an 89-year-old to wait for the culture to correct itself, because I did feel like that the pendulum had swung. And so we published it with a small press. And I would recommend it to any book group, especially in Beaufort, because you will find the story of the whole period of Jim Crow, the South, and of the Gullah influence. I had it read by someone who was the I think commissioner of the Gullah Geechee corridor, and that's Victoria Smalls, and she said it was one of the best novels she's read, and yet that novel could not make it through in the New York publishing world. So now, for children's books, I'm going to let Trish, this is something I was really trying to figure out. We should make some book recommendations. And I said, Trish, I'm really embarrassed, but I think the most influential book in my life was probably The Little Engine That Could. And I would be really embarrassed to this very smart, sophisticated crowd to mention The Little Engine That Could. And she said, no, that was my favorite book. In the meantime, I spoke to Patricia Dinkler about it because I was still unsure of myself. And she said, my favorite book too. And I thought, well, if so many wonderful people have the same feeling for The Little Engine That Could, that I'm going to have to mention it. And so Trish, when I told Trish, I want you to tell us what you said.
Well, it was a terribly important book to me. I mean, I often was wandering around saying, I think I can. And I loved that book. But I discovered that book had been censored. The children were not being allowed to see that book because it was seen as a book that suggested that you could just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you didn't need any social net or anything to help you. And I think a small child who's already feeling so overwhelmed, the idea that you have any agency at all is such good news that I really couldn't believe it. And about shortly after that, then of course, a week or two ago, we saw a book that I actually taught at the university in memoir classes, Mouse by Siegelman. Extraordinary book, one of the early books that use graphic, now we call them graphic novels. When I first started teaching, we just called it a comic book, to deal with really serious issues, this one being the Holocaust. It has been, as you probably all know, censored, which, hey, censor some of my books, would you please? It's now #1 or way up there on the New York Times bestseller list, because when something gets censored, in this country anyway, it can have a completely opposite response, unlike the way things were in Czechoslovakia and behind the Iron Curtain, where if you were censored, the only hope was samizdat, which was people handing manuscripts around in trusted groups. When samizdat no longer needed to be the way of the world after the end of the Cold War, I want you to tell a little bit, Marley, about what you did right after that, in the early days after the Cold War?
Well, I was a group of publishing executives were asked to travel to Prague to help the publishing community make the transition from a communist government that controlled every book that was on the table and on display in the store to a free market economy. And so I welcomed the opportunity to go. And I learned so much, as you always do when you do these things. You think I'm supposed to come to teach them, but I learned a great deal. I thought I knew a lot because of Mihai. To be honest, I thought my husband had given me a pretty good idea of what it was like. He always told me that the best books were under the counter, on the table. You didn't want to buy those books. So when I held up a book, I was addressing a group of maybe 100 anxious people who didn't know what careers they had. They didn't know if publishing would exist. They didn't know what they were going to do. And there was translators, so everybody had headphones. And I held up one of our books, an American book, and I held up one of theirs. An American book has writing on the back, and their books were blank. And so I said, it's important to use every part of the book to help market it, to try the right readers, to find people. And so I said, you find opinion leaders who will endorse the book, and they'll say something positive, and that will help lead the right reader to that book. And there was stone silence. And then one woman, through the translator, said to me, do you ever put negative comments on the back of a book? And so I looked, I was bewildered, and I was obviously bewildered. And I said, no, you wouldn't. You would only put positive things on the book. But my bewilderment was such that one of the women who spoke some English came up to me at the break, and she said, I know you were confused by my colleague's comment, but we don't have opinion leaders we trust. The only thing that would work is if someone from the Communist Party said, don't read this book. And the other experience I had was I was lucky enough to work with Jackie Onassis on a book called The Last Tsar. And Edward Wyszynski, who was coming to New York to go on a multi-city tour, was sitting in my office. And authors were always complaining that when they would go to these towns, that there were never enough books, or there never were books there. They'd walk into a bookstore and they couldn't find it. So I said to Edvard, I want to reassure you that there will be books everywhere you go, that there'll be a stack of books everywhere you go. And he looked at me and he said, well, if there's a stack of books, who would want to buy it? And it was like, it's the book under the counter where you have to know someone, that those are the good books. The ones in the stacks are the ones that you get rid of, So I don't know if the story is helpful, but
Marley, I wanted to let you know, I've let you, I didn't obey you and interrupt you at 12:40, but if you wanted to do your reading or I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
One more thing about Prague, the friendship issue. When Havel was made president, he was being honored at the St. John the Divine. And one of my friends who was conducting the program was sponsoring it. There were 10,000 people in the Cathedral of St. John honoring him. Havel came, and he came with his cabinet. Now, in terms of the power of friendship, every one of the members of his cabinet had been someone he had trusted during the period of the communist rule. And so Mihai and I helped my friend Caroline feed them, and she had a nice big apartment. The cabinet of President Havel had to sleep on the floor and on the couches and the chairs. The government only had enough money for Havel to be in a hotel room. And so the cabinet, there was a philosopher, there was a children's book editor, there was someone who'd been a theater hand, that was his cabinet. And I remember talking to Jackie Onassis about these people. And I said, my God, this is like our founding fathers. I mean, these are real citizens. This is a citizen government. And she was so intrigued with it that she and Maurice Templesman took a trip to Prague, and I set up a meeting with Havel because she wanted to be there for a government at its birth. And I still treasure, I have a draft of the Czech constitution that was being created at that moment that I was there. So now I think I'm going to ask Trish. She has the Art of a Wasted Day. Since we've all been in various stages of seclusion. Something that she wrote in the book that I thought might appeal to all of us, and that she's such a lovely reader. I'd like you just to read that section.
Well, I will, but I wonder if we don't let anybody have questions, then it's going to be hardly any opportunity for questions.
Are we time for questions?
Well,
Okay,
we do have some questions, and
we should go to questions
I
then.
think we should go to questions. yeah.
Okay,
Although I'll read the first paragraph just so you can hear something funny, okay?
okay.
Life, if you're lucky, is divided into thirds. My father used to say, youth, middle age, and you look good. The dawn of that third stage winks is just cutting me in the eye as I lift my hand against its rise. It isn't simply at this point, more life is behind me, behind any middle-aged person, than lies ahead. Middle-aged? Who am I kidding? An interviewer asked Alice Munro when she turned 60 how she felt to be middle-aged. Middle-aged, she said. Who do you know who's 120?
Thank you, Trish. So, will someone repeat the questions for us so that we can answer?
well, here's a question from one of the folks. Again, there's a number of writers that are on the line, and they're listening in. Is there a piece of advice each of you would give to a writer?
About what? I mean,
About writing.
I'm willing to give lots of advice, but
Well,
I mean, is there
I'll
anything-
start by saying, don't try to predict the market. You know, writers will say, well, what's selling? That's what I want to write. Write from your passion, write from your heart. That's my first piece of advice.
yeah, and that's harder to do than you might think, because writing from your passion means climbing up a tree, getting on a limb, and going out to the farthest point before you fall, and maybe you will fall off and break a bone or something. Horrible metaphor, but there it is. So I would say what Marley is saying is true. It sounds like freedom. It sounds like, oh, goody, I get to do whatever I want to do. But the truth is, it's extremely difficult to be free, which is a form of being honest. Not what you wanted to hear, but there's no secret. The secret is there is no secret, you know.
Well, the truth is too, there's no predicting the life of a book, you know, if a book is going to sell or not. If you don't enjoy the process, if writing isn't a burning passion, if you don't enjoy the process itself, you're not really going to be a writer, you know.
Well, I can't actually say I enjoy the process all that much often, but I
maybe not enjoy, but at least it's a refining fire for you.
Yeah, yeah.
It's where you
it's
learn what you're thinking and feeling.
right. It's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Here's another question for you. Do writers, this is for Marley, but Trish, feel free to comment too. Do writers find you, or do you find them? How does that work?
Well, in general, they find me, but there has been like one occasion where I was in a bookstore in North Carolina, and I asked a clerk, this was 15 years ago, to recommend a book that they liked, and they handed me 3 books, but one of them was One Foot in Eden by Ron Rash, and it was published by Mecklenburg County Library. Well, you know, Mecklenburg County Library. So I took them with me, and on the plane I read One Foot in Eden, and I was blown away. And it's one of the only times I've done this. I called Ron Rash, who was teaching at a community college, and said, "You're an amazing writer. Do you have an agent?" And he said, "No." And I said, "If you have something you'd like to share with me, I'd be willing to read it." And I went on to sell about 10 books of Ron Rash's. And Pat Conroy always says that it will be the greatest thing that I ever did was pulling Ron Rash out of those mountains in North Carolina. And Mihai sold him internationally, so that he had, in fact, won an international award. So, but in general, people find me. The truth is, if you want to find an agent, go to poetsandwriters.org and look at their database of agents. I'm not currently looking for people. I'm sort of, and that's not a good thing. I don't like to go to writers' conferences because I like to save those slots for people who are building their client list. But if you go, it lists all the categories of whatever agent is looking for. and try to spend some time studying who they've published, maybe read a book or two that they've done, so you can get a sense of what their sensibility might be and see if you find a match.
I do have a suggestion too. All that Marley says is correct. I mean, obviously. But another way to find an agent, and it is an agent you want, not an editor, because you have to work through an agent, is to find a book or two or three or four that you love by different writers and look at the back. They all thank their agents.
That's
We all
true.
thank our agents. We're on our knees to our agents. And so if you loved a book and you think that's the kind of book I'm writing, and oh, there's so-and-so is the agent, then go to the teacher, what is that called again? Poets and Writers, and you'll find that person listed and you'll find a way to connect.
Yeah, it's a hard time right now. I have to say, I've talked to a lot of people who say it's harder to get an agent than a publisher. And that's why there's this incredible explosion of different kinds of publishing, small presses, the presses that do, you pay something, I don't know what they call it, like co-publishing.
Like Substack. I mean, Substack has become the kind of dot of our culture. If you can't get published in the standard publishers, or you just can't get attention or can't get traction anywhere, you can publish on Substack. And this has happened to a number of people who've been canceled, by the way, including a friend or two of mine. It's the only place they can publish.
I think that's true. And thank goodness for places like that. The other thing is, if you publish at various places, an agent might find you. And so submit essays, submit pieces, and hopefully one day an agent will do what I did, which is to call you and say, gee, I'm really interested in this. I think maybe there's a book here. And so you have to expose your work to an audience in order to attract an agent. And that's part of what the job is. And the younger agents are scanning the literary journals and the magazines all the time, and Substack and various places looking for people. Any other questions?
We still have time for a few more questions if anybody has one, or they can unmute. They can either use the chat icon at the bottom of the page or bottom of the screen, or you can unmute and ask verbally if you'd like.
Somebody's tapping away, I see.
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay.
What are both of you going to do for Valentine's Day?
Ah,
This is sort of it for me.
right. This is a highlight, right? How
Yeah,
pathetic, right?
I'm gonna go out and try to kill a chocolate croissant or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just me and the dog here, so I can
Here's
show you
someone.
a little
What's the
sheet.
best way to fight the censorship? I think that's a good question, Trish. Do you have? I think speaking out and not being afraid to say, I don't think this is right. I think that there's a lot of intimidation that goes on, and that bothers me. That people.
And I think that people don't feel. I mean, when you talk about speaking out, you don't necessarily need to have a platform. You can just in your church group, or in your coffee clutch, or in your dog walking group. Little moments of openness and saying, did you hear that extraordinary memoir, Mouse, was censored in schools in, was it Alabama?
Tennessee.
Yeah.
Tennessee. I was blaming Alabama, but anyway, in Tennessee. And you could say, I looked that book up and I'm reading it and I think it's an extraordinary document. Little moments like that within your own environment. And, there are people who are going to say, well, I could not disagree more. Let them disagree. They know there's somebody in the community who's stood up. And that's what I think too often we feel we have to stand up in some kind of major way. You have to have a platform that allows you to have a megaphone No, you don't need to. You can just say, and you don't want to be a jerk about it, but at the same time, you can find small ways to speak up against a closed mind and against censorship. Or get involved at your library. Libraries are heroic places.
Absolutely. There's someone that's asking for our favorite book about love. And the truth is, I love poetry about love. And I have a secret crush on Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Ah,
I
good
just
for you.
love her work on love. And you got, this Emily Dickinson, A Wild Night.
Yeah, and I love a Whitman. If you read, there's also loneliness and solitude are a longing for love. They aren't just the absence of it, they are the awareness of desire. And there's a wonderful poem by Whitman. Well, he has many wonderful love poems, but he has a solitude poem that I read a lot called I Saw in Louisiana a Live Oak Growing. And it's all about looking at this tree with, all by itself. And he said, I know very well I could not be alone without my friends and lovers near. And that loneliness actually bespeaks love. I also have to say, I love, even though he was kind of a jerk to his wife, I love the Rilke poems about two solitudes meeting and greeting each other, and that this is the, in embracing, this is a great form of love.
Well, I have something coming up in June. One of my debut author. It's a fantastic romantic. It's a rom-com, kind of in the Nora Ephron's fashion, and it's called Nora Goes Off Script, and it's about a woman who has 2 children and a husband who feels he's too good to work, and she supports the whole family by writing romances for the like what would be the equivalent of the Hallmark Channel. And one day he just decides he's just bored with living with his kids and wife, and he walks away. So she ends up writing the true story of her marriage and her breakup. Her agent says, this is really something, I want to try to place it, and it becomes a feature film. And the novel is about what happens to this small suburban community when Hollywood shows up, and the greatest leading man, the most handsome Hollywood hunk, shows up, and he's playing her ne'er-do-well husband. And something happens. So Nora Goes Off Script is a great read for the summer. So, and it'll be out in June.
What's the title again?
Nora Goes Off Script.
That's a great title too.
And who's the author?
Her name is Annabelle Monahan. Nora Goes Off Script. It's so much fun. And I have another fun romantic one, but it's called The Matchmaker's Gift, but it's not coming until later in the year. And that's about a young woman whose grandmother, she finds out, had been a matchmaker on the Lower East Side, something she didn't know until her grandmother dies, and she inherits her notebooks. This young woman is a divorce attorney. And the more she gets into the stories of the matches that her grandmother made, the less inclined she is to enjoy seeing people get divorced. So she's working for a high pressure law firm. And suddenly her boss says, when she says to her boss, I think this marriage can be saved. And their boss says, your job is to make sure they never have to look at each other again. Forget about it. So that book is wonderful. And that's coming in the fall. And it's called The Matchmaker's Gift by Linda Cohn Leigman. And they're both wonderful, and they're lighthearted. I think with COVID and everything else, we can read all the heavy books if we want, but once in a while, a fun read is.
Well, I'll put one on the other side of the scales, a heavy one and an old one, old-ish. I'm rereading a book that I wrote a blurb for years ago, and I totally forgot that I'd written the blurb. I'd totally forgotten the novel. I mean, I've reached the point where I can hide my own Easter eggs, I think. I mean, it's that bad. But anyway, the book is kind of wonderful, I'm finding, but it's heavy, but it's short. And it's called The Visible World by Mark Sloka, S-L-O-U-K-A. And Jean will recognize that as a Czech name. Mark Sloka is a wonderful American writer, but he's actually now, after Trump was elected, he and his 2 kids, adult kids, had moved to Prague, not for political reasons, just because they wanted to go there. So he and his wife followed them, and that's where he lives. Anyway, this book is an extraordinary book about a love affair that was between during the Second World War, and one of the guys who was flown in and parachuted in to assassinate Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague. And it's not just about that moment, it's about how that love affair very sadly colors marriage she eventually has and her son. And I mean, the man can write sentences around anybody. He's a beautiful writer. Mark Sloka, The Visible World.
On that note, ladies, I think we've gone over, but great conversation. And
Thank you.
I think a lot of people are going out to lunch now. I only wish I could go with you. I'm here in below zero Minnesota and you're going to eat outside. I know you are.
well, it's a little chilly here, but it's going to be.
Oh, chilly willy.
It's all perspective.
It is.
Exactly. It was 6 degrees in Minneapolis last time I looked. So.
Oh, wow.
So,
Well,
okay.
really great conversation.
Well,
Thanks for
thank
being
you.
with us. And I
Thank
think
you both.
Happy Valentine's, readers and
Yes,
friends.
and I just want to mention that I think there's nothing better than a friends organization, because everything good that happens in the world happens through friendship, as far as I'm concerned. And I know that the Pat Conroy Center will be at some point announcing a friends organization to try to expand the programs that we do with the schools and things. So
oh, great.
I'm very happy to have been a part of the library's Friends Book Sandwiched In, and I want to thank you for asking us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
ladies. Take care.
Bye.